Presenting Permaculture. What is permaculture? Permaculture is an ethical, holistic design system based on the best examples of nature. The word permaculture is a portmanteau of permanent and culture and was coined in the 1970s to represent the concept.
Permaculture, originally we invented the word. It comes from two Latin roots, permanens, that's one. To persist indefinitely. When you look at the dictionary, to persist throughout, it doesn't say throughout what. So perm. And culture generally are the practices that support human occupation of the earth. It can be agriculture, aquaculture, permaculture. Permaculture is the best one. So that's where it came from. Permaculture definition: the conscious design of agriculturally productive ecosystems which have diversity, stability and resilience of natural ecosystems. There it is, all written down for you. There's all sorts of definitions of permaculture. There are some I love. There's a bloke who looked very much like Karl Marx one day. He even had an overcoat like Karl Marx. Everybody left the lecture theatre and one light was still on. He stood between me and the light looking like Karl Marx. And he said, and he wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the wall, and he said, "You know what you've done, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, I think I do." "What are you thinking of?" He said, "You've made a sort of wardrobe in which we can hang all human knowledge in relation to each other." Do you like that definition? I loved it. I thought, wow, how bloody perceptive. I don't know who he was, and he never asked me to follow him, so he's no trouble. I thought it was very good. And other people have made different definitions. You can gather 100 definitions of permaculture, and everybody has their own definition.
Permaculture design is a system of assembling conceptual, it's very key, material and strategic components in a pattern which functions to benefit life in all its forms. That's an excellent one right there. The philosophy behind permaculture is one of working with rather than against nature, of protracted and thoughtful observation rather than protracted and thoughtless action, of looking at systems and all their functions, and rather than asking only one yield of them, and of allowing systems to demonstrate their own evolutions. Permaculture is a way of looking at the world through nature's patterns and systems to solve problems and live regeneratively and ethically. That's how I teach children about it. That's in this book. And then with the book that we just got, the Permaculture Student 2, the definition I have in here is, in simplest terms, permaculture is a way of seeing the world through nature's eyes, a lens through which to view the world based on the three ethics: earth care, people care, and future care. This requires constant observation and adaptation as nature is constantly changing. Permaculture is action-oriented. It provides a framework for ecological and sustainable problem solving and design. It can be applied to anything because everything is sourced in nature, its patterns and its cycles. The way cities are designed, food is grown, homes are heated, and communities interact can all be redesigned using the permacultural lens to be sustainable, ethic, and regenerative. Permaculture enhances, organizes, ethically frames, and solves.
Permaculture focuses on how nature does it. How does nature solve problems? How does nature solve spatial relationships? And in permaculture design, we have examined and observed natural systems and synthesized a set of protocols. And we use those protocols to design, so far, just about anything. So permaculture design is using nature for design solutions.
This is the permaculture tree, a natural analogy I've used to organize this presentation into 4 main parts that correspond to areas and functions of a tree in this case a fruit tree. Let's look at part 1. Part 1 is the roots. This is the often unseen foundation of permaculture, the origin, the germination, and establishment of the underground life support systems of the permaculture tree. Part number 2 will be the branches and leaves. This will be the action and application of permaculture, the visible above ground growth of the tree. Part 3 is the fruit, the potential realized both within a permaculture project and as a whole. It is the yield received. It is the obvious results of the previous 2 parts. Part 4. Part 4 is the seeds, the reproduction of both the permaculture concept and the tree. This is what connects the cycle back to the beginning. Now let's dive underground and into part number 1. The roots. I will be going over everything from origin and observation through ethics, principles, and intent. I've divided this part into 5 main sections. The first being origin, the second observation, third ethics, fourth principles, and finally intention. Permaculture as a word, concept, and design system originated from these 2 men, David Holmgren and Bill Mollison. David Holmgren's contribution to the origin of permaculture started as a young man during his years at college when he crossed paths with Bill Mollison.
I'm David Holmgren, and I'm best known as the co-originator of the permaculture concept in the 1970s with Bill Mollison. Sometimes there's 2 stories that are told about how the idea of permaculture really came about. One story is that Mollison was my supervising academic and I was just some technical assistant who worked with him. And then there's the opposite of that, which is I was the brilliant student and he was the academic who stole my work, which neither of those are true. I mean, for a start, he was my mentor while I was working on that permaculture manuscript. But if it had been left to me, the permaculture manuscript would have just mouldered away in a drawer. It was Bill who was like, no, we're going to take this to the world. The core of the idea of permaculture really came about when I was coming towards the end of my first year in environmental design. And my interests were gravitating around ecology, agriculture, and landscape design. And I could see how 2 of these connected, but I couldn't see anywhere where the 3 crossed over and intersected. So I wanted to look at that. At a seminar about how land is owned and controlled, there was a bloke there who said some really interesting things. He pointed out that the rabbit problem in Australia could have been solved by rabbit trappers, but they had no incentive to do so because they didn't benefit from the land being in better condition from there being less rabbits. So what did they do? They farmed the rabbits on the farmer's land. So he was pointing out that the ownership of the land had this really adverse effect on the sustainability of the land. I thought, God, this guy thinks just completely different to the academic ecologists I'd met. And that was Bill Mollison. I got chatting with him afterwards. And I was actually developed this relationship with him, moved into his house, and we were discussing my plans for this focus in my course in the second year. And I said, well, I'm interested in this intersection between ecology, agriculture and landscape design, and how natural systems could influence that. And he said, oh, how about this for an idea then? If most places on the planet, nature creates a forest, why doesn't our agriculture, if not look like a forest, function something like a forest? Why is our agriculture all composed of only annual plants that grow and die in 1 year? Whereas in nature, there's a diversity. And that's exactly in that intersection. And I said, oh, that's exactly what I'm interested in. By understanding how nature designs things, we can create permanent agriculture and permanent culture in everything we do. And that became permaculture.
It comes from two Latin words, permanens, to persist through time, and culture, an activity that supports human existence. So put those together, it's a persistent system that supports human existence.
And that became the beginnings of a passionate, full-time, total immersion with Mollison effectively as my informal mentor, no relationship in my academic work, to an intensive study that led to the Permaculture manuscript, which was later published as Permaculture 1 in 1978 and was the starting point of permaculture as a public concept. So it's something that emerged between the two of us at a time when there was a huge wave of interest in what we might call sustainable solutions today. Before the term sustainability actually was in the lexicon, before there was any serious discussion of the limits of the environment reflected in pollution and biodiversity loss and land degradation. So permaculture came out of that, what I call that sort of first wave of modern environmentalism, and not just oppositional environmentalism, but very much the positive environmentalism of what are the solutions, and even more so than that, not just what are the solutions that those at the top should implement, but how the way we're just going to go out and create the world we do want and the work that is the world which is sustainable.
David Holmgren went with his family and they just lived off the land and put this stuff, into real action. Meliodora is a wonderful book if you can find it. He goes over an actual example of doing this stuff, and he doesn't have it be theory, he has it be real.
So Bill was my mentor. We were developing the first permaculture garden on the fringes of Hobart and persuaded me that we should publish it. But I didn't have a lot of the experience in all the different fields that underpin permaculture. And so my passion was about doing those things and building Meliodora here. I was only in my early 20s and I wanted to actually ground all these ideas in the huge practicality of ecological building, of organic gardening and agroforestry systems and aquaculture and all the practical skills, as well as of course the design processes that permaculture was about. So I put myself through a really intensive self-teaching education process that has never stopped. Whereas Bill was ready for a larger stage, and taking permaculture to the world was his next agenda, and develop the beginning of the permaculture design course. And that mechanism was really how permaculture spread, not just in Australia, but around the world. So although I was the co-originator of the permaculture concept, Bill was the father of the permaculture movement.
Bill Mollison was born in 1928 in the small fishing village of Stanley, Tasmania. He had many jobs throughout his life, many of them often taking him deep within nature in both study and interaction with flora and fauna, especially in the areas of Australia and Tasmania. His interests and various careers have brought him to the point where he met David Holmgren, and in 1974 he and David Holmgren developed and refined the permaculture concept, leading to the publication of Permaculture 1 and Permaculture 2. After leaving the university in 1978, he devoted all of his energies to furthering the system of permaculture and spreading the idea and principles worldwide. He's taught thousands of students and has contributed many articles, curricula, reports, and recommendations for farm projects, urban clusters, and local government bodies. He received the Right Livelihood Award, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel Prize, for his work in environmental design. Later he established a trust and aid fund to enable permaculture teachers to reach groups in need, particularly in poorer parts of the world, with the aim of leaving a core of teachers locally to continue appropriate educational work. He was the executive director of the Permaculture Institute, which was established in 1979 to teach practical design of sustainable soil, water, plant, legal, and economic systems to students worldwide. He passed in 2016.
And so to our first farewell to a science person who died during this year. Let's go back to how we celebrated his achievements in the science show way back in 1982.
I'm glad to present our awards tonight to men who understand what's going on. Thank you.
Jakob von Uexküll, the man who established the alternative Nobel Prizes. And here's the first recipient, Australian Bill Mollison of Tasmania, who gave us the term permaculture, and whose ideas about environmental management have now been recognised internationally.
A couple of years ago, I resigned from a tenured job at the university, threw myself in an advanced age into an uncertain future. I decided to do nothing else but to persuade people to go about building good biological systems. I existed for quite a while by catching fish and pulling potatoes, but I'm good at that. I'll always live. Then I started to make some money by designing sustainable systems for people, for their own houses and for their villages. And since then, I've been able to train 20 people at a time. Until now, I have 400 young people designing systems throughout Australia. In the coming year, we'll be training people in Germany and in Brazil, and we've set up a sort of brotherhood and sisterhood because half of us are women. I don't believe women are any better designers than men. I think they're better about living systems. The thing we must do is make a very large movement towards a very quiet sort of revolution. Permaculture is an interesting system. It is not, thank goodness, gardening. It's certainly not the terrible work that we used to do when we were peasants. And it's designed to give you maximum return for minimum space, and it accepts all sorts of spatial configurations. I know, because we have long ago analysed it, that every city can produce all its own food. I believe we're faced with an absolute choice. We can build the sort of cities we're building, continue to do the sort of work we're doing, continue to accumulate resources and power to run around like blowflies in cars, and that will inevitably kill us before long. What I regret is that it kills so much else besides ourselves. However, it is possible for man to live easily on the earth. It's possible for us to construct biological systems that work. For a fraction of the cost of Swedish armaments, Sweden could become an entire system like this. It's up to you. It's entirely up to you.
Bill Mollison of permaculture fame, receiving the Alternative Nobel Prize in Sweden in 1982. He died in September this year, aged 88.
This is design, and what you bring to it above this line are visible structures, the infrastructure. You all know what an infrastructure is. It's a road or a bit of wire or a fence or something, a thing that joins things up. The organic systems of forests and animals, the water systems, the things we build, and the landscape. They're the things we work with. And under here, which is just as important, are the invisible structures, the legal structures under which we operate, that is, the legality of our institutes and how we hold land and things. It is of great importance to a group to get their legal structures right, particularly those who hold land. The financial systems, trusts, forming trusts, and the ethics under which you operate are not visible. But if you put this down, this is what permaculture is. It's very hard to explain to people what it is. And it's the application of common sense design to a place and people in it, and it involves all this, the visible and the invisible structures. We'll deal with how you design them all as the course is about that. Every element should serve many functions. Everything we put in place should be good for several things, and normally are. And we design for function. I'll tell you a story about Melbourne now. I love telling stories. When I started, I first came over here, I don't know when, say 77, somewhere there. And there was a strong body of landscape architects on deck over here, and more coming along, and there are still more training. And so you really got a lot of landscape architects. But I don't know where they got the architect bit, because really they're into colour and contrast and stuff, you know. They're not into any sort of function. But then they invited me over to talk to them at their annual meeting. And I heard from one of them, who works with some architect friends of mine, that they'd invited me over to tear me to pieces in front of their wives as an after-dinner entertainment, like sort of Roman. We've got a Christian and we're going to let the lions onto him. So I came into their presence advised of their plans. So you are those landscape architects in Melbourne. Two of you might have been there. And you're all there in your little dicky shirts with your black ties, and your ladies in their long silk gowns and golden hair and pretty ribbons. And they're all looking at me very expectantly. So this is what I did. I got up in front of them. I picked up the mic. I didn't forget the mic. I took my wristwatch off and I put it there. And I said, is anybody here involved in functional design? Then I did an awful thing. I waited for 5 minutes. I said, okay, now we've established and know bugger all about functional design. I'm here to talk to you about that. And they didn't make a peep, and you could see the The women all had their forks and they're sticking it to their husbands. Tearing to pieces, go on. You got them. You know, I advise you to take that approach to people who come to tear you to pieces. The moment you take the wristwatch off and put it down, you've got them really. And the next time I did it was in America, and it was the first meeting of sustainable system academics. And they were all profs. And the best grant I heard about there, one had $6 million grant, but many had the millions of dollars. And they were all in this long room around this table, and they each had a secretary with them. And they invited me along because I was running a course up the road. And I went in with some of my course members, including one old farmer from Kentucky. And they told me I could ask a question while I was there too. I asked them, could I ask a question? They said, yes, of course you can. So they should have seen the signs. I took my wristwatch off, I put it there, and I said, now, I would like somebody here to define what they mean by sustainable. And that dreadful 5 minutes passed. And then I said, so now we all know you don't know what you're talking about. I think we'll leave. So my students who were sitting around the wall got up, and the old bloke from Kentucky was the last man ever. He turned around at the door and he said, you bastards are all the same. You're always making a one-step solution for a four-step ditch. They don't know what they're doing, and they don't have the answer. So, I can tell you that no landscape architect in Melbourne knows anything about functional design, and no agricultural system in the United States knows one thing about sustainability.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, you hear the word sustainable waffled around everywhere today. It's in every aid organisation proposal. There is, I think. And if you ask someone to define sustainable concisely, they usually can't. And they often go on and on for 5 minutes. And that usually means they can't really get their head around what sustainable is. It's really an energy audit. If a system's sustainable, it produces more energy than it consumes.
Over its lifetime.
And you've got to finish it by saying this, really. But that's enough, but actually to explain it, enough over its lifetime in surplus to maintain and replace that system.
Than it took to build it and maintain it.
You can say it in 2 sentences, or a big sentence with a comma in the middle. That's it. After that, get on with it. And you'll find that you'll have to work with real-time energy budgets, which involve the sun, which we'll get onto.
Here are a few more people I would like to highlight, both for the relevance of the origin of permaculture and this presentation. First, Jeff Lawton. He's the man you saw in the previous clip teaching with Bill Mollison. Jeff is a world-renowned permaculture consultant, designer, and teacher. He took his permaculture design course in '83 with Bill, and ever since then, he's undertaken thousands of jobs teaching, consulting, designing, administering, and implementing in 6 continents and over 50 countries around the world. Clients have included private individuals, groups, communities, governments, aid organizations, non-governmental organizations, and multinational companies. He has currently educated over 15,000 students in permaculture worldwide. These include graduates of the Permaculture Design course and courses focused on the practical design of sustainable soil, water, plant, animal, energy structures, legal, and economic systems. Masanobu Fukuoka is a man who figured out and developed many of the permaculture techniques before permaculture was organized into the concept and design system it is today, which is why he is often referred to as the grandfather of permaculture.
Fitting to watch one of Masanobu Fukuoka And this video, it's not at his place, but it's him touring and talking about some of his philosophies and principles and some things he believes. And a lot of it goes back to this book, The One Straw Revolution. This is kind of like a basic, I guess, overview of the video, but if you really want to get into learning more about Masanobu, this is a great book. And this was actually one of Bill Mollison's favorite books for a long time. And some could even call him, and I like to call Masanobu, the grandfather of permaculture. His real basic starts with the main principle that we went over, which is work with nature. So let's get into the video and you'll be able to see. Since this video doesn't actually take place at Masanobu's farm, a lot of the audio is what I really find value in, some things he says. And if you guys have seen my garden wrap, I quote him in some of the stuff, his idea that rain comes actually from trees, and he'll talk about it right here.
You said no rain around here, they can. The true reason of lack of rain is no trees. No trees, no rain. You believe rain falls down from above, but it is not. Make a condition to produce plentiful water. That's the start.
Another one of Masanobu Fukuoka's principles, and what forms really his main philosophy, he calls it do-nothing farming. And this doesn't mean be lazy. This simply means don't do unnecessary work. That's really what he looks at. His main questions, he doesn't ask what I can do. He rather asks the questions, do I have to do that? What don't I have to do? What happens if I don't do that? What happens if I don't do this? That's really where he forms his main philosophy. He wants to see basically how he can get beneficial connections between things in nature doing the work for him rather than against him. Fukuoka style of gardening, he does no cultivation, no weeding, no fertilizer, no watering, any of those kinds of things. And how he does it is he actually puts all of his fruits, his vegetables, all that stuff, puts it all together in a mix in clay balls, which he's going to show you right here, and then goes and just scatters all them. That's his main thing. He scatters clay balls. He just throws them around and sows them all throughout. And one of the reasons he can do this is because he lives in Japan and they have a really wet, rainy spring, so you can't do this everywhere. I've tried it before. It works all right, but in my location where I live, I just don't have the space, like I said, so it just doesn't make sense. It makes a lot more sense for me, and I can just go out there and plant the things where I want them to grow. But if you had a huge location and you wanted to plant like acres and acres of land, this could be a great way to do it. And he shows it actually right here, an awesome way to make the clay balls. One thing he says is when you're planting these clay balls and when you're planting seeds, to go out and play like a child, to have fun, to enjoy yourself. He said kids in Tanzania would make like wrist rockets, and that's how they shot the clay balls. That's how they planted their seeds. That's one thing I really take into account, and one thing I really think about when I'm going out and planting in the spring or whenever I'm planting a seed. I always want to make sure I'm in a good mood. I always want to be super thankful that I have this opportunity, and I know that that goes into the seed. That gets imprinted because everything comes after its kind. And this here is my favorite part of the whole video. They go to a place where they're actually doing natural farming, and Fukuoka has never been here before, so he's amazed, and it's all right. Everything is good and he loves it, because throughout the video he goes around and criticizes a lot of the things they're doing that are wrong, because they're tilling, they're plowing, they're going against what's natural. And this place, there's locations that people have never been, and Fukuoka just loves it.
Here is another man who developed a lot of the permaculture techniques we use today, all on his own, Sepp Holzer.
My mentor, rebel farmer, international visionary, one of my favorite human beings. A really strong, powerful guy. You know, don't get in his way with anything or you're going to get mowed right over. And so I'm really fortunate that I get to come in after he did a lot of this backbreaking litigation and opened up these pathways, provided these successful projects so that you can just point to them. And then it makes it a lot easier to convince different authorities, to convince different parties, if there's something you can point to on the landscape and say, hey, look at this, look at what they did, look at the long-term effects. Now we can start to build that credibility in that long-term portfolio.
Sepp Holzer, an Austrian mountain farmer, is a well-known specialist and visionary for permaculture and landscape healing. Water is always at the core of his work. As a consultant in many countries, Sepp Holzer sees the consequence of deforestation, monoculture, overgrazing and industrial agriculture. All these factors destroy the natural water balance.
Farmer Sepp Holzer made a name for himself by successfully challenging this damaging practice. Out of the sterile monoculture, he has created a fertile and productive farm, the Krameterhof. He grows cereals, fruit, vegetables. He even farms fish. Sepp Holzer has transformed his 45-hectare farm into a unique landscape by combining ecologically sound permaculture with the traditional techniques of terracing and raised beds.
Das hat man ja früher schon vor Jahrhunderten, Jahrtausenden schon gemacht. Terrassen, die Reisfelder Asien zum Beispiel.
Farmers have been making terraces for thousands of years. The rice paddies of Asia, for example, or the Berbers in Morocco. The Aborigines in Australia, or the indigenous North Americans. Even here, people have done this. If you walk in the country and look carefully, for example, in the Tyrol, you can see that people have collected stones and rocks from the fields to make walls and terraces. It's easier to work the land that way. So what I do is simply recognize, redesign, and revitalize.
And so he started out at the Krameterhof, which was his family farm. His father gave it to him. It's an Austrian tradition that the firstborn son takes over the family farm. And so when he took it over, he had spent his whole life playing in the dirt. He really loved everything from growing salamanders to all these different plants to making little ponds. He was a kid just playing in nature, as we often do if we're presented the opportunity to do so. And so once he took it over, he had all these grandiose ideas that he started implementing. And a lot of people thought he was crazy. There's stories of his dad being in the bar down in the town and everyone saying, "Your son is ruining your farm, what are you doing? You got to stop him." And he said, "It's his farm now, it's out of my hands," and legally it was. And so everyone thought he was crazy until he created what is really this paradise on a mountainside, and now everyone wants it. And so on this land, 45 hectares, which is about 120 acres, of what was really, it's a rocky, steep hillside way up in the mountains. It's hard to fathom how high up in the mountains it is until you go there. And it was even poor pasture. It was really thought of as just kind of scrub land for growing pine monoculture and for growing some grains and things of that nature.
Sepp has learned from the mistakes of this kind of forestation. Over the past 40 years, he's put back much of the land's original diversity. His ponds and terraces make a stable and fertile base for the wide variety of crops he harvests. The Krameterhof is a haven of fertility on his mountain.
And he created this beautiful oasis of 72 interconnected ponds and lakes, a whole aquaculture, a whole agroforestry system, and this farm that's incredibly productive as a farm just on its own right. It's incredibly valuable as a teaching tool as well, and then it's incredibly valuable as a beacon and a place for people to see and start to bring these ideas to their own landscape. And so water is the chief element. Water is the ultimate capital of any farm. And so he really looked at how to maximize water retention on the farm.
For me, water is the most important capital. Wherever it's possible, you should create retention spaces and collect the rainwater and relearn with the water how to maintain a balance. This is the most important thing, because once you've created the right hydrological balance, 70% of the work is done. You help rich vegetation to develop, diversity, because nature can reveal itself and develop in the right way.
And it's just a beautiful place that at this point these systems are going, and no one could be on the farm for 10 years and it's going to be producing a lot of food. It's going to be a really vital habitat for all the wilderness around, all the wildlife, and then you could come back to it and start cultivating it again at any point in time.
To reiterate and summarize the origin of permaculture, permaculture originated in the hearts and minds of David Holmgren and Bill Mollison. In the interest of coming up with ethical solutions to the problems they saw people and the natural world facing, they came up with the concept that shortly turned into a design system. It focuses on connections and functions, understanding those connections, and using holistic thinking to harmonize with nature and everything being designed. It's about symbiosis and synergy and syntropic systems thinking applied toward the pursuit of co-creating abundance and the conditions to truly thrive, in other words, maximizing our potential. It's based on the timeless examples in nature, including many sustainable ideas from indigenous peoples and modern cultures, as well as the application of appropriate technology.
All these things that we're talking about in permaculture, sustainable, nature-based design integration, this is all based on native and indigenous wisdom. So I'm not here tonight to tell you that this guy from Australia designed the solutions to all of our problems in the 1970s, because that's not the case. This is all based on thousands and thousands of years of folks that knew how to live in harmony and balance with nature. And it's us modern humans that have stepped away from that have said sort of, we know better, we can design these boxy grids and roads where we can just sort of isolate and separate ourselves from nature, and that's not really working out for us anymore. But thankfully, Bill did come along and start asking a lot of these questions in the 1970s. He was an ecologist, a university professor, and him and David Holmgren, they came up with these initial design principles.
They travel Australia, they go Africa, they go South America, and what they doing? They observe. They sitting, they living with the tribe, they observe what is the principles of these people to make continue permanent in this earth.
And very much so what they were focused on in the very beginning was agriculture. There were no words really for sustainable agriculture in the English language at this time. And this was sort of very reactionary. Bill and David, they were looking around at what was going on in the ecological, industrial, and agricultural scene in Australia, and very much so what we're dealing with here in the US today, where we have these large factory farms, monocrop, annual, massive soil erosion, and it was creating all these problems, all these issues. So Bill said, I'm going to take some time off away from the university and spend time in nature and observe. And that's just so critical in permaculture design. It's really the first principle is observation. So that's what these two gentlemen did. They observed natural systems and they started writing books.
Which brings us to the second section of the roots, observation, which is learning through nature's best examples, including and especially forests, past human interactions, and cultures. For a specific project, observation is the first step in the design process for getting to know a place. Here we seek to recognize patterns in plants, elemental movements, and the animal presence and movements. It is very useful to recognize and think about things from overall patterns to individual details as we seek to figure out the parts of the whole. Section 3. Ethics. This one is very simple. Earth care, people care, future care, all connected and overlapping.
We differ from anyone else I know in that we adopt 3 ethics. We take care of land, we take care of people, that's a corollary of taking care of land, and we return our surplus to those 2 ends. Fair enough? 3 very simple ethics. See, that's where we differ from universities and colleges and churches and all that. We have ethics. And there's nothing here about, sodomizing anybody. So we think we're morally better than the rest of those bastards.
Section 4 is the permaculture principles. A lot of these are self-explanatory, but if you need more details about them, you can go to my previous videos or other sources online. Sometimes there are alternative principles used, but this is a list of the 12 common ones often used. Observe and interact, catch and store energy, obtain a yield, apply self-regulation and accept feedback, use and value renewable resources and services, produce no waste, design from patterns to details, integrate rather than segregate, use small and slow solutions, use and value diversity, use edges and value the marginal, creatively use and respond to change. And here's a blow-up of that chart from the bottom right. And the fifth and final section brings us to intention. This is the purpose, motivations, importance, goals, and reasons behind it all, behind the origin and development of permaculture as a concept, and the implementation through a specific design or project. Often very personal yet common on some level, it's the culmination of thoughts applied to a purpose, the passion and direction behind the action. Our intent is what connects our choice right now to the future. Intention is the mental companion to emotion, and together they make up the heart and mind of design.